Hello and welcome to this very first episode of Boredom Matters, the ISBS podcast, with me, Annie Runkel. This podcast is all about boredom and boredom research. So if you are interested in boredom, if you ever wondered why you get bored sometimes, why boredom feels so horrible, or what boredom could possibly be good for, you're in the right place. And I'm very excited and happy to welcome you to this new podcast series. So you probably wonder, what does ISBS stand for? Well, it stands for International Society of Boredom Studies, which is an academic society with members all around the globe. And I'm very pleased that I actually have the president of ISBS with me today to actually talk a little bit about the society. So I think that will probably be a good start to our podcast today. So here she is, Josefa Ros Velasco from the University of Madrid, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about the Society of Boredom Studies.
Yeah, thank you there, Annie, for your words and overall for all the efforts you are putting to carry out this project of a podcast series as part of the International Society of Boredom Studies activities. Well, I should say now some words about the ISBS to encourage people to join us and to take part in this project. The International Society of Boredom Studies is a non-profit organization we set up to promote and disseminate multidisciplinary research on this topic, on boredom. We all are scholars working on boredom from different perspectives, and we all together are establishing a network of experts on boredom studies to give visibility to this field of work. And of course, to move forward boredom studies themselves. To do so, we are creating spaces to dialogue, to collaborate, to show each other what we are doing, what we want to do, to find partners worldwide in our careers, to pursue stays with researching groups in other countries. So we are more than 50 people right now, and together, we already held the 4th International Interdisciplinary Boredom Conference the last summer, one which will be, by the way, celebrated biannually. And we are also collecting papers in a database, lectures in our YouTube channel. We are about to launch the first International Journal of Boredom Studies. And finally, we will have our newsletter circulating really, really soon. And now we have also this new section of podcasts, which is truly fantastic. I think we are growing really, really fast. This is perhaps because boredom has now become the topic of a multidisciplinary conversation. Psychologists study its cognitive effects and its physiological manifestations. Philosophers and historians ask themselves about its nature. Sociologists seek to understand its social causes and consequences. Learning experts investigate boredom's outcomes on learning and its role in different learning environments. And of course, the public tries to come to terms with an experience that appears to be really trivial, but it's in fact serious at the same time. So in this sense, the society aims to serve as a home and as an information hub for anyone who is interested in boredom. Membership is totally free. This is important. So I encourage all those who think of boredom to join us now. You're welcome independently of your area of expertise, your age, your gender, your institutional affiliation. And the level of commitment depends always on your own decisions. So in the ISBS, there is a space for everybody in whatever situation. Come on, join us, and please, this is also important, don't confuse us with the Boredom Society, which is a completely different kind of association.
Great. Thanks, Josefa. I think that gave our listeners a pretty good idea what ISBS is all about. I hope it'll inspire some people to find out more about the society. Obviously, we have a website, which is just boredomsociety.com. That's probably the best place to start. And it's also where you can learn more about the Boredom conferences. On the website, you can also find links to all the recordings from our most recent conference in June last year. I definitely recommend having a look at it. There's some fantastic talks about a wide range of topics. You can also hear me rambling on about boredom and creativity. So highly recommended, not just for boredom geeks like us. Yeah, so for this very first episode, I thought it would be useful for our listeners to maybe find out a little bit more about boredom sort of on a very basic level. So I thought I would actually pose one single question to a number of people from all across different disciplines. And that question is, if there was one fact you would like people to know about boredom, what would it be? And I was lucky to be able to gather a whole group of academics and researchers who have been willing enough to talk about their research on this podcast. And I'm very pleased that they agreed to answer this very particular question. So we've actually got someone from psychology who's going to answer the question, as well as someone from philosophy, from sociology, and someone who works in the area of architecture and design. So I'm very excited to have this whole variety of people who are going to answer this very specific question. So I'm going to start with Eric Igou, who is at the University of Limerick in Ireland. I'm very pleased that we managed to get him onto the podcast. We actually did this recording on quite a stormy day, with quite a bad gale kind of battering not just Ireland, but also the coast of Scotland, where I am based. So I'm very pleased that it worked out and the internet didn't let us down. So do you want to sort of introduce yourself, Eric?
Yeah, thank you. So where I come from is I was socialized in Germany. I studied in Heidelberg, and then I went to New York on a postdoc and got a post at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, where I met Wijnand van Tilburg. And then we went to Ireland together to the University of Limerick, where Wijnand got his PhD. And then he moved on to Southampton and to King's College, and now he's in Essex. Now, why do I mention Wijnand? Because he is my main collaborator in boredom research, and he plays a very important role here.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, would you like to give us your insights about boredom and what you think is sort of one fact that you would like to share, or can you easily answer the question about, like that one little gem of knowledge?
Yeah, so I would say that boredom is a challenge to people because it is a denial of the needs that they have to live a meaningful life. Right, so the current situation can be seen as boring and by that meaningless, but it can also be generalized to life, of course. Right, that is not only unpleasant at an affective level. There are a lot of cognitive elements in this. Namely, it communicates to us that we're living a life that we shouldn't be living. And so, what do people do then? Well, it's a conflict that they try to solve. And I believe that boredom is almost ideal experience to demonstrate the various ways that people can respond to an existential conflict using self-regulatory strategies. Because it's not just one way. People are quite flexible in responding to boredom. So, for example, they can approach certain situations, they can avoid certain situations, right? So let me get into the approach one. As it is a threat to our meaning, what people try to do is they try to compensate for it. They do that by searching for sources of meaning. And in line with that, we could show that when people are bored, social identity increases because this is a source of meaning, right? You cluster the world in groups, and I am part of this great group, and there are these other ones out there, and they're not as great as I am, right? Nostalgia is another source, and helping others, pro-social behavior is also. So these are examples for an approach, right? But then there's also avoidance. Avoidance strategies can also be used by people who are bored. Perhaps when sources of meaning are not readily available. So what do people do? Well, they might choose to withdraw from the existential conflict by focusing on sex, drugs, or rock and roll, perhaps. But what we found is unhealthy eating, for example, can be used as a strategy. These exciting, unhealthy foods have the ability to fill us with joy, and it reduces this focus on this existential conflict, right? We've also looked into how people are kind of desperate and trying to get out of this conflict by demonstrating that impulsivity increases and risk-taking does too. So that wouldn't be an approach towards sources of meaning. These are more strategies that enable people to withdraw from the existential conflict. So these are two fundamental strategies: approach and avoidance. What we've done lately to just validate this meaning regulation approach is that we presented people with sources of meaning, right? So for example, self-compassion or gratitude, these are experiences and orientations that give us meaning in life. And as meaning in life is closely related to boredom in a negative way, we could find that these experiences and orientations reduce boredom. And especially these later studies are useful for practice, because what these studies promise is that by increasing experiences such as self-compassion, gratitude, or other experiences that communicate to us that life is meaningful, that they reduce boredom.
That's so interesting. I think boredom is so often simply dismissed as trivial. Your research really shows that powerful connection between boredom and some really big questions like purpose and meaning in life. Thank you so much for sharing that, Eric. I think this gives us quite a smooth transition to my next guest, who is actually a philosopher. Andreas Elpidorou is based at the University of Louisville in the US, and I'm very pleased that he could join us. Andreas, before we get down to business, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me and everybody else on the podcast, Annie. I don't have the coolest origin story. I've been working on boredom for a while now, which is it's strange saying it out loud. Time flies, but it's been more than a decade thinking about boredom. And initially, I am trained as a philosopher, and one of the kind of philosophical questions that always captured my attention was our relationship to the passage of time. So how I began getting interested into the phenomenon of boredom was this realization that boredom is this weird experience that when you are bored, time changes, or at least the perception of how time passes changes. And I was fascinated by that aspect of boredom. And then what was a catalyst in addition to that kind of interest was the fact when I started looking at the history of boredom, most accounts of boredom have been pretty negative. At least historical philosophical accounts were always conceiving of boredom as more or less a toxic state, sometimes as a sin, But if it wasn't put in a religious context, it was something that you wanted to avoid. And I became very curious about that, just to explore whether that's indeed the case. And I've gone through phases, and I think my first phase was a really kind of naive optimism about boredom, that it's great and like we can do a bunch of things about it. And now I've come not quite full circle, but I've realized that there's much more to say to that. But that's how I began my journey into boredom studies.
Nice. You have published quite a lot on the topic of boredom, haven't you? You've had a whole book about boredom out fairly recently, if I remember correctly.
2020, and it's part of it is on boredom. It's not entirely on boredom, but it's the idea is, and this is again, this goes back to what I described as my optimism, perhaps naive, perhaps not. That I think there is something good about boredom, but it has to be seen in the correct light under the right conditions. And boredom, I consider boredom to be a part of states that are unpleasant, experientially unpleasant. However, they can be important for the pursuit of the good life. And so the book is an exploration of what to do with those negative states and emotions that are unavoidable in our lives. But I also think that they're quite useful. And so that's just trying to think through those kind of thorny issues and how to navigate life in the midst of all those negative emotions and sensations and bad thoughts and all that.
Okay, that's really good. So for anyone who's curious, the book is called Propelled: How Boredom, Frustration and Anticipation Lead Us to a Good Life. And I'm pleased to say it's actually quite affordable. So do check it out if you want to. Anyway, so if I put the question to you, Andreas, do you have a simple answer? What is the one thing you would like people to know about boredom?
Yeah, I think I can. Well, on one reading, the answer is pretty simple. I would like to tell them that boredom is really complex. So I think I can do that. I can say that it becomes more difficult to try to explain to people what the complexity is. And so I've encountered that complexity personally, both as someone who experiences boredom, not quite as often now, but I remember in my past life that I was bored for a long time, and I've gone through frequent experience of boredom and prolonged experience of boredom, and always boredom was very complicated. The emotion itself, or the affective state, was just so, there is that agitated level at it or experience, or I don't know what to do quite with it, but also low energy and thoughts and desires. And so I struggle with that in myself. But the more I study about boredom, the more I realize that I don't quite get it, which is, it's a funny thing to say after all these years, but I think it's quite true. And so why I'm excited about the society partly is the fact that I've realized that, a philosophical perspective of boredom takes me so far given my discipline, but then getting in touch with scholars from other perspectives, I keep learning things about boredom that I would not have encountered, and that just enriches my experience and understanding of boredom. And so after the conference, for example, that was organized in the summer, I came out of the conference realizing, whoa, there's so much more that I don't know about boredom. And so that kind of complexity, not just experiential, but kind of the richness of the phenomenon as the subject of philosophical, scientific, sociological, historical study, that just fascinates me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can all agree to that. Thanks so much, Andreas, for sharing your thoughts. Okay, so I think we have to move on to our next guests. Mariusz Finkielsztein is based at Collegium Civitas in Poland. He is a sociologist, and he's actually the person who first got the ball rolling when he set up the International Interdisciplinary Boredom Conferences quite a number of years ago now. So I'm really glad that he could join us in this very first podcast today. So Mariusz, you've probably been involved in boredom research for quite a while now, haven't you?
Yeah, it's been 10 years now. And this is a long story, and my story is different than Andreas's. because I was a MA student when I started, because I was so agonizing bored during my classes at the MA studies for a variety of reasons. Then I start asking questions about this boredom. I start to talk about boredom with other people as a kind of data collecting process. I deal with these a lot of negative emotions, and that boredom is a kind of taboo. Sometimes even a kind of ridicule. This is ridiculous for many people that I research boredom. So I felt alone at my university, at that time University of Warsaw. So I started this conference in Warsaw in 2015. Just to not to be alone in this kind of research.
Brilliant. So I guess your research also directly led to your new book that also came out very recently, right? Because is it about boredom and academic research, if I remember correctly?
And it is already published in August, I suppose. It was published in August. Boredom and academic work. This is my a shortened version of my PhD thesis. So it was highly controversial at my university at that time, because they felt that I accused academic teachers to be boring. But during my project, it starts to be more about work, not about teaching itself. So maybe it was more acceptable at the end.
That is actually quite interesting, because from my perspective, I also came across that kind of reluctance or maybe prejudice against somebody wants to do something about boredom. So I kind of experienced that in the context of art institutions that felt that they wouldn't want anything to do with anything that has the name boredom in it, just because it kind of casts maybe a nasty reputation on them.
Is a god in nowadays culture.
Yes,
everything should be adventurous, interesting, thrilling. And boring is counter to this discourse.
Yes. So if I ask you the same question, one particular little piece of information or fact about boredom that you feel like that's something you want people to know about it, what would it be? Or is that an easy thing to answer for you?
I was wondering how to answer this question. There are so many thoughts in my head. So there is a popular saying that I would combat, that intelligent man never gets bored. This is a platitude that I heard all the time. And this is not true. So what I want to say that we cannot understand boredom as merely idleness. Because this is the way of thinking with this saying. Boredom is idleness. Intelligent people have their brains, they are smart, so they never have this situation in their life that they are idle. But this is not true. That researchers say that this is the opposite. That the more you're smart is, the more the higher level of your boredom. There are several reasons here, but maybe two are the most important. If you are a working man at the factory, it will be easier to manage and to survive this kind of work if you don't have this high intellectual potential and so on. And if you are miserable, with this kind of boring, repetitive job. And on the second level, if you are intelligent, so you go with self-reflection, and you have thoughts about life, about the meaning of everything, and maybe you figure out then that many things are bereft of meaning, and that ultimately your life is meaningless in very particular sense. That this meaning should be constructed. This is a whole process, and this is not so easy. So if you are intelligent, you see more threats to meaning. If you are not intelligent, you don't think about, you just do this, go with your life one way or another without self-reflection on the much higher level. In a way, this protects you from experiencing and feeling, especially feeling boredom. Maybe you experience some boredom, but you don't feel it so eagerlessly. So and so you are less miserable with your boredom if you are not intelligent. Yeah. So this is this popular assumption that I frequently heard, and I want to combat.
Yeah, I think that connects very nicely with what Eric was saying earlier as well. That connection between boredom and meaning is so powerful. Thank you so much, Mariusz. So my final guest on this podcast today is Christian Parreño, who is at Universidad San Francisco de Quito, which is in Ecuador. Very pleased to have him here with us. I really like the fact that we're sort of, spanning the entire globe with this podcast. It's brilliant. Christian, maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about what kind of research you do and how you ended up researching boredom.
I research boredom in terms of architecture and the experience of architecture, what can also be called a spatial experience. How I came up with researching boredom is sort of a long story, but I'll try to make it concise. I was working in London as an architect, designing big buildings. And I remember one day, my supervisor came to me and he told me that he wanted me to embark on a bigger project. And that would entail taking care of all the details, the technical details of a facade for the next 2 years. And instead of being happy, I was utterly disappointed. And I didn't know why. But I remember that afternoon, I went to the library of the Architectural Association in London. And just by pure coincidence, I ran into A Philosophy of Boredom by Lars Svensson. And it was kind of like an enlightening moment because I realized that my feeling was boredom. So in that moment, I thought, this is it. This is what I want to do. I don't want to do 2 more years of technical drawing, but I want to understand this condition in a philosophical manner and seeing through architecture. So it caught my attention, quite early in my studies, that the term boredom in English was coined in the 19th century. Yeah, so it's a very young word on the one hand, but on the other hand, the etymology of boredom relates to the action of making a void, creating a void. And that is a special condition, it's an architectural condition. So the way that the term emerged, it was related to the way in which the feeling on this or the sentiment was sort of experienced in terms of space, dimension, even measures and the quality of the space. And from then on, the studies continue.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. I think your perspective is really quite different from what the other people so far have kind of been talking about. So that idea of the void, or there's sort of being a space that is, or not space maybe, that is kind of connected to boredom. I find that really interesting and completely different approach, I would say, to what we've kind of heard so far in the podcast. So that's really great. So if somebody asked you if you had one particular sort of fact about boredom that you would share with someone if they asked you, would you be able to pick something in particular out, or is that sort of a very difficult question and you wouldn't be able to sort of pinpoint one particular fact or aspect of boredom?
It's very difficult to pinpoint just one. I think that there are many. But perhaps I could summarize them in 3 points. Point number 1, the relation to the environment. Understand boredom as a sort of crisis of how we relate to what is happening around us. And that could be understood as architecture. Architecture not just as a building or not just as the physical object, but also architecture in terms of how we relate to this environment. Kind of like a point in between. It's not you, it's not the building, but it's kind of this sort of conversation that you begin to establish. In a way, it's a little bit like Heidegger points out. He says boredom is a hybrid. It is partly objective and partly subjective. So that would be one aspect of boredom. Second aspect of boredom is the history of boredom. And boredom changes, and it's a cultural condition, depends on society, depends on economies, depends on technologies. And I think that is an aspect that is very little studied yet. And the final point that I would like to make is that boredom is very ambiguous. It's positive, but it's also negative. It's both things at the same time. And it can also derive from lack of something, and therefore is related to the void, to monotony. But I think it also can derive from the opposite, from too much, from having too much information, from having, I think it's Teresa Belton who says, too much junk around us. And therefore, it can also become this sort of point of entry into the unnoticed and also into creativity. Boredom can derive into destruction, but boredom can also derive into creation. And again, it goes back to this relationship between the individual and the environment. So how our environment, in a way, sort of kind of disposes us into perhaps a good boredom or a bad boredom.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Christian. So I guess this is actually a beautiful conclusion to our podcast today. Thanks again to all of my guests. It's been an absolute pleasure. And of course, also thank you to you, my listeners. I hope this very first episode gave you a little glimpse into the vast universe of boredom studies, and you learned maybe something new about this particular experience and why boredom matters. I think this half-hour journey into boredom has really revealed some quite interesting things about boredom. As my guests pointed out, it's complicated. It's neither good nor bad. It tells us something about ourselves as much as it sheds light on our relationship with our environment. It defies the easy assumptions many people have about it, and even though boredom seems to be such a trivial, everyday thing, it connects with some quite profound topics such as the meaning of life. So I really hope you'll consider joining me for the next episode. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next episode, maybe pop over to the International Society of Boredom Studies website, which is just boredomsociety.com, or you can also follow us on Twitter, which is at Boredom Society in one word. Quite easy to find, I think. Thank you very much once again to all of my guests, and speak to you soon. Don't get bored. Or maybe do.